Thank you, Scott. Hello, everybody. Welcome. Um, Thanks for the introduction. Uh, yeah, as Scott mentioned, I try to do about 10 minutes or so of um, uh, education, and it usually pertains to something that seems to be in the air. If you're like me, you have kind of the themes emerge, like people are talking about different things or different issues come up one after the other, and or it's something in my own life. And so the word of the day or the word of the week in terms of people I'm having conversations with seems to be shame. So I wanted to talk about a little bit about shame and what to do with it, and some practical tools we have to release shame when it happens. There's I'll start by just saying a couple of things. One, Carl Jung, who's I'm a big fan of actually, described shame as a soul-eating emotion. I think sometimes we describe it as soul-crushing, but basically shame is one of those emotions that um, happens or occurs, and there's really not a lot that can be said that's very useful out of it. It's really kind of empty calories for emotional distress. And then Brene Brown, who we're also a big fan of here, says the difference between shame and guilt is the difference between I am bad and I did something bad. You know, one of the things we always talk about at Seeking Integrity is to help our clients understand that, you know, we are good people who did bad things. You know, we are not bad people. And that really is the essence of shame, is that I am a bad person, I'm a flawed person, there's something wrong with me. And it's this internal sense of just being damaged. In fact, that I often hear the phrase of my own clients over the years, I feel like damaged goods. Besides, there's just something really wrong with me. And that addiction only kind of is the cherry on top that kind of cements the whole thing in our belief system. So it's really important to recognize the triggers that we have for shame, to recognize when we're falling into that shame spiral, which is where we just kind of go down and down and down, and it can be a very hard time climbing our way out. So I want to just talk about a few techniques that I find useful and are useful for my clients as well. One, first of all, to recognize the triggers. And I want to say, you know, no infant ever comes into this world with shame. Shame is something that is really bestowed to us. It's given to us. It's taught to us by our caregivers, by our parents, by our siblings, by our people at school, our peers, through bullying or different, or the church, or through politics. The messages of shame are so pervasive and so complete that I think we really have to kind of be aware of it. But we internalize that. And without getting off in the weeds on kids and neurology, kids are not hardwired to refute shame. If somebody teaches them to be shameful about themselves with statements like, you know, what a loser you are, or what an idiot, or kids take that right in, and they start to believe that. And so we create this belief system about ourselves that really can be triggering the rest of our lives unless we kind of deconstruct that. And so it's really important to recognize those triggers, and they're individual for different people, you know, whatever they are for you, that can elicit that pain, and maybe specific words, you know, like the ones I just mentioned, if those come up in thought. The problem with that, with when kids are taught shame, they internalize it to the point where we start to say it to ourselves, right? That self-talk that's very negative and whispering in our ears all the time, undermining us, putting us back into that shame. So if it does happen, I think it's really important to kind of deconstruct it right on the spot. You know, what just happened? You know, what was that? What were the words? What was the thought? What was the feeling? You know, what were the circumstances that just did this, that caused this reaction? And remembering, by the way, that shame is not the same as guilt, which is a feeling about something we've done, right? Shame is about there's just something wrong with us, you know, our very essence, like who we are. And that's nowhere for a healthy recovery. So it's really just to look at those triggers, look at what just happened. For example, did someone say something to make you feel vulnerable? Was this a reminder of some situation in childhood where you teased over this issue? What just happened? And when we're not in our addictive cycles, we have a more of a opportunity to use what I call the observer self, right? That person, like almost if you could imagine separating from yourself for a brief moment, you know, go 6 feet away and watch yourself like a camera would, and say, what's going on there? And sort of it helps remove us from the immediate emotion and kind of take a step back, like, wow, what's going on there? So that's one useful tool. I think another one and I was talking about with our clients earlier today, practice self-compassion. You know, when we're in shame, we are so bogged down, and it's really hard to feel good about yourself in any way. So I think it really has to start with self-compassion, to talk to ourselves and treat ourselves with the same kindness and love that we would treat someone we love, or a child, or someone we really care about. So pretend that we're cherished. You know, that we have a slogan in the 12-step program, act as if, right? So we may not believe it, but I think we have to start practicing that to let us know that we are cherished and valuable, and not mired in this shameful being. And there's a lot that goes on with that too, by the way. There's really interesting things with our bodies. You know, there's been experiments, if we smile, even if we're not feeling like smiling, a bunch of hormones start to cascade that make us feel better. Just the act of, even if we're having a crappy day and we smile, there's something to that. And the same thing goes when we practice self-compassion. We start to flow a little bit of oxytocin, which is this love hormone, they call it, that makes us feel better. It's a soothing kind of state. So that self-compassion is a huge antidote, especially for that self-criticism that comes with shame. Next thing, challenge those thoughts. You know, oftentimes with shame, there's what we call looping thoughts. These things just go around and around and around, and we can't seem to break out of that cycle. That leads to that spiral of shame I mentioned earlier. So, you know, constantly revisiting situations where we get shame, or constantly thinking about thoughts, or constantly undermining ourselves or questioning ourselves, all that can lead to this shame spiral that we so want to avoid. So our challenge is to really weaken the grasp it has on us by challenging the thoughts, if there's a negative critical voice in our ear, to really counteract that with affirmations and changing our beliefs, and really avoiding that negativity, what we call negativity bias, where we just start to see everything wrong with ourselves, everything wrong with the world, with the situation, and no redeeming qualities, nothing good. And it's a really skewed and inaccurate way of seeing ourselves. And we have to kind of correct that bias that we can have. And that self-talk, you know, that negative critical voice in our ear, we have to really challenge that and not believe it. And two more. One, learn how to receive love and kindness. I think one of the great challenges for me in early recovery, and I still see it with a lot of my clients, is that because we're feeling a lot of remorse and not very good about ourselves, and not very deserving of good things, I think it's really hard to accept compliments, or accept positive feedback, or accept positive energy from the universe, because we don't believe it. It may sound false. It may sound just, you know, that old belief that a lot of sex addicts have. If you really knew who I was, you wouldn't, you know, say I'm such a nice person, kind of thing. And so I think we really have to learn how to receive love and kindness. And again, it's almost an act as if thing, where we have to learn how to take it and receive it, even if it doesn't quite feel right. And you know, how many times have someone give us a compliment, instead of just saying thank you, we challenge it. It's like, no, that wasn't such a big deal, or whatever the thing was, we minimize the compliment. So don't reject kindness, you know, and accept it with gratitude. We talk about gratitude here a lot on this webinar. So learn how to receive it. And then finally, practice forgiveness. You know, I think forgiveness goes with that self-compassion, and it's forgiveness for others, but it's certainly part of the recovery process, I believe, is forgiveness for ourselves, for the things we've done, and not to be that, you know, we don't take ownership of it, or take responsibility for it, or for that matter, have to make amends for it and correct it. But we, at some point, if we're going to get better, have to start having some compassion and forgiveness for ourselves and the things we did. And I think it's a parallel process to what happens, I think, if we've been unfortunate to have abuse in our lives. I think a lot of the forgiveness process often occurs when the person that was abused can start to realize the abuser was also suffering and wounded, and kind of carried it on. And I think having forgiveness for them, by understanding it, we can do the same thing with ourselves. And so I just really encourage us to, especially in the world these days, to really practice kindness, and accept ourselves for the really good human beings that we are. So, and I would say, just to conclude with that, is to turn that shame that we have into empathy. You know, empathy for ourselves, empathy for others, where we're really connected. Because really what shame does, and you know, addiction is very selfish, and shame is really kind of selfish anyway. When we're in shame, we're really wrapped up in ourselves, and it's almost kind of the opposite of ego. It is ego, really, but it's a reverse ego. It's like, oh my God, I'm so terrible, and we wouldn't feel good about somebody who constantly bragged about how wonderful they were. The same thing goes if somebody's just really down on themselves all the time. That's a negative space to be in. I think we really have to turn that into empathy and kindness. And I think I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, David. Yeah, that last statement always reminds me in AA, I hear people say, oh, I'm an egomaniac with an inferiority complex. And,
Right.
and you know, I totally get that. I'm a piece of shit, but on the plus side, I'm the world's biggest piece of shit, you know? So it's like, if I'm going to be a piece of shit, I'm going to be a really huge one. And it's crazy what shame does to us. Also, one of the things I heard, this was at a Brene Brown training, and it was one of her assistants who said, you know, we learn shame from other people. You know, other people teach us to feel shame, but as we get older, we learn how to do it all by ourselves. We don't need other people to feel shame. And I see that in myself, and I see that in guys at our treatment center, and I see that in sponsees, and I'm sure you see it with people you work with in your practice and at the center too. Can you talk a little bit about how we self-shame and just dig deeper instead of reaching out?
Yeah, totally. And you're absolutely right. And it's that process I think I was referring to where kids kind of are sponges for that kind of stuff. And we start to believe what we're taught, especially with repetition over time. And so after a while, we don't need critical people around us telling us, being critical, because we've internalized it enough. We're very good at it ourselves, and probably far more critical than anyone else could be. And the really insidious part about that, it's really an inside job. So there's no corrective mechanism. It's like the whole, if we really believe that we're that flawed, there's no way to correct that. It's our universe inside us. And so, yeah, the way to do that is, I think, really it has to come almost from the outside first, by people in groups or in 12-step programs, or people that we start getting connected with in recovery. They start to reflect back to us usually this image that doesn't match the real negative image we have about ourselves. And we have to kind of figure out what that discrepancy is about, and gradually learn that we have a very skewed belief about ourselves, and that we have to kind of correct it in recovery.
Yeah, and you know, Brene Brown, you mentioned her. I mean, she talked, by the way, ask us questions, use the Q&A feature. We've got one in there already, which I'll get to in a second. But she talks about the antidote for shame is empathy. And, you know, we just have to get it out and in front of other people who are kind and thoughtful and will feel empathy and will correct our misperceptions about ourselves, because those you know, I am completely unlovable. I mean, that's shame in a nutshell. And it's just not true. Every person is lovable. Doesn't matter what we've done.
Can I talk about the hardest risks for people to take too, right? To start to bring that out and take the risk of really verbalizing that, and then hearing the feedback that comes.
Yeah, and then the fear is that if I become vulnerable and share my deepest, darkest secrets with you, that you will run screaming from the room. And that is always, you know, that's always been my fear, is if you said it earlier, if you knew the real me, you would run away. That's shame. And the only way to overcome that is to risk that actually happening. You know, so that's why we define sort of loving, empathetic people. That's why 12-step meetings and our drop-in groups here and things like that, where there are other people dealing with the same issues you're dealing with, are so valuable for most of us, or a therapist where, you know, the first person to hear all my crap was a therapist, and I thought, well, I'm paying him. You know, he can't run screaming from the room. I'm paying him. But I learned to trust him, and then I learned to go to 12-step meetings and trust people there, and then my circle of trust has grown over the years, and thankfully.
But you know what's so perfect to what you just said, Scott, is that that's exactly the mental process we go through. It's like if we believe, if we're riddled with that much shame, we're going to doubt anybody that tells us anything different, right? Yeah, exactly. So,
Yeah, it's like my mother says I'm pretty, but she's my mother. She has to, you know. It's not true. She just says that because she's my mother. Another quick question. You mentioned shame spiral. Can you just explain that term and what it really means in case people are unfamiliar with it?
yeah, so a shame spiral is really when shame is triggered by whatever event or thought or words, and it starts to kind of bounce around inside us and amplify and grow, and there's no corrective mechanism to kind of neutralize it or stop it, and it takes on a life of its own. And we've seen this where it possesses people, and it can really just become this loop. I mean, I talked about looping thoughts, where it just kind of circulates in the brain, and the more that happens, the worse the person feels, and the worse they feel, the more they have a shame. I didn't mention the term, by the way. There's the term's not important. The concept is that people start to feel shame about feeling shame, right? So, I mean, it just amplifies itself. And so that shame spiral really brings people down to this point where they're just like riddled with shame and no way out. And so it's something we really want to avoid. And because, you know, sometimes a painful emotional experience has a lesson in it or some teachable moment or something, but there's not much of that at all with shame.
Yeah, I always think of a shame spiral as usually it's triggered by something external, but then my internal shame generator kicks in, and I just, you know, basically flush myself down the shame toilet. You know, and it's just, you know, it's my shame that like pushes the handle on the toilet and starts the flush. But yeah, I won't carry that metaphor any further. It gets a little gross. All right, let's go to the Q&A before I say something I regret. Hi, Dr. Fawcett, a huge fan of you and your book. I'm so grateful for what you've done for the world. I am a 27-year-old male who really enjoyed reading your book, felt like a life-changing experience. I'm in recovery for sex porn addiction, and I have always identified as heterosexual, but have struggled with HOCD. I assume that means something. HOCD, David?
I'm not sure.
Maybe you can type in what you mean by HOCD. For most of my life, but in the midst of my love addiction, porn, sex, apps addiction, I have this compulsive desire to dominate gay men and use them as feminine objects. I have zero interest in the male genitals, but during acting out, I thought of these feminine men as women who would give me easy sex, and even thought of their body parts as women's body parts in my mind, almost like sex dolls. Even had to think of women to orgasm when I was with them. Every therapist I've gone to has told me that I'm straight and that I used operant learning with my conscious desire and belief that I had to try to force myself to be gay because intimacy with women / rejection was so difficult. My sexual attraction to women was always present, even with men. In therapy, we uncovered that I was sexually abused as a child and that my arousal template got infected. I'm not sure we love that term, infected. Is it truly possible that porn can change our arousal templates and confuse our sexuality? Have you heard stories similar to mine? I feel a lot of guilt and shame for not being gay, which is a twist there on the usual guilt and shame bit we get from sexual orientation. There's a lot packed into that, David.
Yeah, so let me talk about sometimes when we have kind of unusual sexual attractions that don't seem to fit what we kind of normally think of as our arousal template like that. So we have a self-identifying heterosexual man here who has this particularly sexual desire to dominate gay men. But what I will say about this, and this is, I think, important, that's a scenario, it's a script, it's a fantasy that is very specific. And I think we often see this with heterosexual men who may be attracted to transgender men or transgender individuals, or like any other kind of element of our arousal template, it can get quite specialized. And now in terms of this being a man as opposed to a woman, I think, I'm not sure what the derivation of that's not, the origins of our arousal templates and some of the elements are often a mystery to us. But I think what I would, one of my takeaways from this is that there's kind of an intimacy issue there that probably does stem from abuse in your childhood, that where safety and trust and vulnerability is something that's hard to get in your normal sexual interactions. And so I think our arousal templates kind of help us create these certain fantasies, and they're often power, which you describe here as an element of that. I don't know in terms of gay, straight. I think in fact, more and more these days, I don't even like those binary choices. I think there's a whole spectrum of things that people, and some of it's situational. So I think I would just kind of really not spend a whole lot of energy trying to figure out why it's man or woman. That might be an important part of the story, but I think more important is your ability to to be vulnerable and trust, and that's going to take, I think, reworking or going back into that trauma and doing some trauma therapy. And then until you do that and figure out how to operate safely with emotional safety, I mean, in the room, in the world, it's going to be hard to kind of sort that stuff out. And so arousal templates and their power. And so, yes, I think this is a really important thing. You say, is it truly possible that porn can change our arousal templates and confuse our sexuality? So we know from porn or sex addiction, or for that matter, chemsex, anything that really derives from the experience of dopamine. Dopamine is something that constantly our bodies can adapt to, and so that we need more of that stimulation to get the same effect. And we see this all the time with pornography, especially. It's the most clear-cut example where people start to venture off into other areas of porn, other types of porn, just to get the stimulation. And so it may be more taboo or rougher things or kinkier things, or from a heterosexual man starts to look at gay porn, or vice versa. And so it's just anything to kind of be unusual. Underage porn is another area where people are getting all kinds of problems that they may not be ephebophiles or pedophiles, but they have drifted into that because it's kind of intriguing and exotic. And so, yes, our arousal templates can lead us astray in this effort to get that dopamine kick. And so it can happen. Now, what we also know about arousal templates is that once those changes have occurred, once those new elements are incorporated into our arousal template, so perhaps domination of a man in your template, for example, if that's a really high power fantasy, meaning it has a lot of appeal for you, that is probably going to be something that will be an element of your arousal template for the rest of your life. And this is where it gets tricky for recovery, because oftentimes those elements, let's not use you, let's use a methamphetamine user, for example, who combines meth with sex, who gets off into some really disturbing, and their perception of it is a really disturbing fantasy, but just because it had great erotic appeal, very dark perhaps, that is always going to be there. And obviously it's disturbing, they don't want it in there, but it's kind of hardwired into their arousal template. And so the challenge of recovery is to not go to that thing which it's kind of a big bright spot in our arousal templates. It's hard to avoid it, but in recovery we have to find other things that are erotic and arousing and interesting for us. And the best we can do, at least right now, is to kind of let that uncomfortable fantasy just kind of go dormant. But the more we interact with it, the more we think about it, the more we go there, the longer it's going to stay alive. And so the challenge in recovery for chemsex and sex addiction, for that matter, is to really let our brains reset, learn how to find things that are healthy, that are also stimulating for us and erotic. And those things are out there. But if we're caught up in the early phases of recovery, when our arousal template has been totally hijacked by the super stimulation of porn or sex addiction or drugs and sex, nothing normal is going to seem very interesting. And that's why we recommend kind of a period of sexual abstinence, no masturbation, no porn, just to kind of let our brain, we use the term reboot, not a clinically accurate term, but you get the idea. It helps our brain kind of settle back in.
Thanks, David. I looked up HOCD, homosexual obsessive compulsive disorder, a term that's used to describe having unwanted, intrusive thoughts in relation to your sexual preference. So that's what that means. So I would call it ego dystonic sexual thoughts or sexual orientation thoughts. Means like we don't want to have them, but we're having them.
Right, right. And for those of you that don't know the ego dystonic, the term, when ego dystonic simply means that I am not comfortable with that being in my own head. It's like I'm uncomfortable with this whole thing, as opposed to being okay with it. And so we often see that with, in fact, when we look at the DSM-5, our manual of what's a mental illness or not, right? What's a disorder. Homosexuality, obviously, thank God, is not in there since the 70s. But what is in there is ego dystonic homosexual attraction, meaning if I'm attracted to men, but I'm really uncomfortable with that, that's something that a therapist can work with. Not to change the arousal, because we can't, but we can help that person come to terms with that, whatever that means. The same thing with different paraphilias, the sort of unusual sexual tastes. Those are also not, as long as they're between adults and consenting, those are not considered a problem unless it's ego dystonic, meaning the person themselves is uncomfortable with it and wants to change it.
Yeah, I mean, I would say the most common example that I see is a guy who's ostensibly straight. He's married to a woman, but really he's got some attraction to men as well, in whatever way. And the ego dystonic part is the attraction to men. He just doesn't want to deal with that or look at it or whatever. That's fairly common. David, can you talk a little bit about sexual shame and how it plays into, you kind of touched on this, but how it plays into our arousal? First of all, how it manifests, whether it's abuse or emotional neglect can be a form of sexual, developmental neglect can be a source of sexual shame, and then how that forces its way into our arousal template, or it affects our arousal template, and also just how we think about sex in general.
Right. So, we talked about how the sources of shame, right, they're external from caregivers, peers, whatever, and they quickly become internalized. So it's there. And once it becomes internalized, it can manifest in sexual orientation terms, for example, in internalized homophobia, right? We get people who are gay, but who desperately don't want to be gay and have a lot of shame and internalized judgment about it. And that often gets projected. I always have to laugh. Well, I don't laugh, but I note that a lot of the most outrageously homophobic lawmakers, whether it's in a state legislator or the national government, the guys that really pass these really hard homophobic laws, almost inevitably will come out as they'll get caught with a gay escort or at a gay bar, or they're struggling with their own gay stuff, and it gets projected out onto other people. So it manifests that way defensively and internalized homophobia, but also I think we often say that shame is really the core feature that is the root of a lot of sex addiction, simply because of this uncomfortable feeling with who I am, and that if people are out in the world kind of understood me and that I was so unworthy of love or had these weird attractions or these strange thoughts, strange in my mind, they wouldn't care for me. And so we start to seek attachment and intimacy and sex in other ways that kind of starts to skew how we interact with the world. At the same time, it impairs our ability to connect or attach, to develop an intimate relationship with other people. They really become a barrier for that.
There's so many forms of sexual abuse. I mean, I grew up in a household where sex was a taboo topic. We never talked about it, so I never learned anything about it. Nothing was ever modeled for me. And, you know, as I grew into adulthood, you know, anything sexual, I just felt deep shame about because it was so taboo. And every time I had a thought, it was taboo. And then I was gay and society was telling me that was wrong. So even though nobody ever like touched me inappropriately, you know, I feel like I was in a lot of ways sexually abused. And then I learned about covert incest later on, which is a whole other story. So I probably was, but you know, it's just, it created so much shame and affected my behaviors and my arousal template. Most of the time when we think about, you know, early life sexual trauma, however it occurs, we think about it as being overt sexual trauma, where you know, somebody's being molested or raped or whatever, and that gets sort of internalized and added to the arousal template. Can you talk specifically a little bit about how childhood sexual events that are traumatic get sexualized and added to our arousal template, which may be a little bit of what we were seeing in this question here, or a lot of what we're
Right. So it's pretty common when a child is abused sexually, especially, although it can happen with neglect in other forms, where that becomes, and you use the term infected for your arousal template, but I would prefer the term hijacked or something like that. But and a lot of the original work on arousal templates talked about how they can really get, I think John Money, who coined the term, talked about tainted, but you get the idea. It skews the arousal template in that there's this other element that's been inserted there that's different than a kind of normal psychosexual development of a kid. And so oftentimes, if there's abuse, first of all, it can be very confusing because it's not always violent, and sometimes it feels good to the child. Sometimes they like the attention in a world where they're not getting attention from adults, and the whole thing can be very confusing for people sometimes. And so it can get incorporated into the arousal template in a way that becomes kind of an erotic appeal and sometimes we talk about reenactment as an adult, where people have a repetition compulsion, if you will, to carry it out over and over again. And the idea is that if I can recreate it in a safe way, in a controlled way, then I won't be harmed, and there can be some kind of resolution, and that I don't think happens as much as people would like it to happen, where there's resolution as opposed to more wounding or more harm. But I think so it can get incorporated into, so we often hear about the people that have been abused have a much higher risk of becoming abusers. And I think some of that becomes not only in the attachment styles, the intimacy styles, but also in terms of some of the particular fantasies and scripts and events that have occurred to that person. They become the way that the person, they almost become the norm for how someone expresses themselves sexually as an adult when they grow up. So it can repeat and carry on. So yeah, it can manifest in different ways, but that's certainly one.
Ask us more questions here. I'll hop on to the next one. I'm 62 years old, in recovery for over 11 years. Semi-retired physician, double boarded in internal medicine and palliative medicine, and still carry low self-esteem from a dysfunctional childhood. 11 years of psychotherapy have helped, but on a bad day, I go right back to the damaged 10-year-old kid I was convinced I was. I don't think it ever goes away completely. Do you agree? Great question.
Yeah, and thanks for sharing your experience there. I certainly have had a lot of shame in my life, and I still have some, and I think, yes, I think, will I always have shame? I'm sure I will, but I can say that I don't think shame controls me like it did at one time. And I do think there's, with work and you say 11 years of psychotherapy, they've helped. But I do think if we really work on some of the things I mentioned in the opening, some self-compassion, empathy, forgiveness of ourselves. I think when I've had clients who had trouble kind of breaking out of that shame, the shame lessons that they were taught early on, at some point, I think often there's still this, they're really hanging on to that piece that's very self-critical and judgmental of themselves and harsh on themselves. So I would just encourage you. I think a lot of people I've seen that have started to get through this have really started to practice that self-compassion. There's I don't know if you've ever, a lot of men kind of roll their eyes when I suggest this, but I think inner child work is amazingly powerful because it allows us to connect with that wounded part of ourselves that's still in there. That little boy is still in there. And by the way, I think that's where addiction comes from that wounded part of ourselves. But to really start to have compassion, and there's whole therapists that specialize in this kind of dialoguing with your inner child, and it's really powerful stuff. And there's some good books out there too on that. So I think I would just keep at it. I wouldn't throw in the towel because I think certainly you'll probably always have some vestiges of shame, but it shouldn't be crippling. It shouldn't be painful. It shouldn't be where you drop back into it if triggered. You know, that I think you can move beyond that. Certainly, you don't have to live that way. And I would try, a different kind of therapy. I believe that talk therapy, and I'm a therapist, and talk therapy is powerful, but talk therapy is not enough for a lot of these experiences, especially where trauma is concerned, where it's a different experience, it's a physical experience, a somatic experience, it's an embedded experience that's in our nervous system, and we can't talk our way out of it sometimes because the mind, our prefrontal cortex doesn't recognize everything that can go on. Some of it is experiential, and so I'd recommend a trauma therapist or who can deal with some of those nonverbal therapies that can really start to release that stuff. Something like breath work. Breath work's an amazing therapy to start to release some of this. So I'd shake it up a little bit and see maybe a couple different therapeutic modalities might be helpful for you.
Keep forgetting I'm muted. We have one of our Wednesday morning webinar series, which is a different person each week. And I think the second week of the month, but check and double check. We have a guy named Eddie Caparucci, and his specialty is the inner child. You may want to check out Eddie's webinar. I think it's next Wednesday. And you can also go to our YouTube channel and look up his past ones. He spends a lot of time talking about the inner child, and he's fascinating. And really, it's his specialty, and so that might be cool for you to do. I'm with you on, just when I think I don't have any more shame, when I think I've worked through it, it pops back up. And the good news for me now is after years and years of work is I recognize it for what it is. I recognize I'm feeling shame, and then I can do the things that David suggested, like, challenge the thoughts and, run it past another human being, things like that to debunk the shame, basically. And the interesting thing is, for me, shame is the master emotion. I think that's true with a lot of addicts. Shame is our master emotion. We think it's anger. It's not. It's shame. Shame is under the anger. Shame is under the fear. Shame is under the anxiety. It's under the depression. For me, anytime I have those other feelings, I try to look at the feeling under the feeling, and that feeling for me is usually shame. My shame has been triggered, and then I start to do it by myself, and then I'm depressed or anxious or afraid or angry is more often than not.
I want to say one thing. I heard this great little expression that we can't always solve a right brain problem with left brain techniques. And that means, the left brain are people that are analytical and methodical in their thinking, and a lot of trauma affects what we call right brain stuff, some of the deeper kind of nonverbal, non-cognitive stuff. And those, we need therapies that address both. So if we're doing traditional cognitive behavioral therapy, it's not going to be adequate, I think, to solve the whole problem.
Yeah, I mean, and to that end, I had to learn how to let people hug me. It made my skin crawl when people would hug me. And it wasn't because of them, it was because of me, because I had so much shame, and I thought that nobody could want to even touch me, let alone hug me. And I really had to, and it was therapy for me to go to a 12-step meeting and all these idiots hugging me at the end of the meeting, making my skin crawl. And I sat through it. And now I love to hug. I just thought, well, you idiot moron, can't you see I'm uncomfortable? And they could, which is why they were doing it. You know, and they helped me break through some of my shame. And you know, they were also doing a lot of the things that David suggests we do, which is sort of debunking the shame. Of course I'm going to hug you. You know, big bear hug, not letting go, even as I'm squirming. It was kind of amazing that these people just continually did this for me. I used to say they did it to me. Now I say they did it for me. And that was a very right brain thing to me. It had nothing to do with and I'm very left brain. And that was extremely right brain. And it's what I needed to break through a lot of my shame around touch. So I love that, as a matter of fact, I love that you brought that up, the left brain, right brain. Because I do think shame lives in the right brain. I mean, logically, we can look at it and go, well, that's not true.
Well, and seems like we're talking a lot tonight, but I hope it's valuable. So I think, you know, trauma, when trauma happens to a kid, it's not a cognitive story. It's not thoughts. It's feelings and sensations that go right to the body, because a kid's cognitive capabilities aren't even formed yet. And so it's really hard to describe in words what's happened at that kind of pre-verbal level, if you will. And so I think it's really important to recognize that we need both to work it out.
And we've talked a lot about in this webinar about identifying feelings in the body, where they live. And, you know, I know where my anxiety lives. I know where my shame lives. I know where, you know, my depression lives. You know, different parts of my body have certain feelings that help me identify them. But I had to learn that because I could never put I had to identify what I was feeling in my body and then have this little emoji chart, before we called them emojis, you know, little smiley face and sad face, you know, with words like depressed, anxious, sad, you know, frustrated, under these little round yellow faces, so I could identify how I was feeling, because I was so bad at it as, you know, in my 30s. As a grown man, I had no idea what I was feeling from one moment to the next, because I learned early on to just shut it down. And then I couldn't talk about those things, not in my house, heaven forbid. So, let's see. Can someone who is a straight identifying man, this is a follow-up from earlier, be gay or bisexual without any attraction to the male genitalia? So that's our question here. Interesting.
So, in my experience, an attraction to genitalia is part of the attraction. Overall, I think with very few exceptions. So I would say a bisexual person would be probably attracted to both the genitalia of male and female genitalia. The scenario described, and I think this is maybe a little interesting and very important fine point, in that if you're not attracted to genitalia, but more the scenario or the script, that feels very much to me like a sex addiction kind of scenario, right? Where it's not so much genitalia there, but probably with power or humiliation, or we get into these other dynamics where other things hold the erotic potential. And so I think it does sound more and more like that. What you're describing is something that's kind of evolved, not so much based on an inherent attraction to male or female, but as a result of these fantasies, protective. I'm sure they're serving a purpose, but yeah, I think usually, long story short, there's attraction to genitalia there. If you want an interesting book, it's a tough read, but it's called The Erotic Mind by Jack Moran, M-O-R-I-N. And he deconstructs a lot of this in great detail about how these certain fantasies can occur, that basically his theory is that they help us, sometimes even these twisted fantasies help us be sexual as a way to overcome all the damage that's been done through different abuse and in ways that we would just be otherwise not be able to function sexually. But our brains help us kind of creatively find a solution that we can have an orgasm. So it's a fascinating book. Tough read, but it's a fascinating book.
Yeah, and sexual orientation is a weird thing, and it's hard to define. I always say, well, when you started masturbating, who were you thinking about, boys or girls? And when you go to the beach, who are you looking at, the men or the women or both? When you picture yourself 80 years old sitting on the couch watching the news, and sex is 30 years in the rearview mirror, or however many years in the rearview mirror, who do you want to be with, a man or a woman? And that's kind of how I think about sexual orientation. I mean, those are questions that work for me. They may not work for you. But even at like the age of 80 for me, and I'm sitting there watching the news, I'm probably going to want a male partner there next to me because that's who I'm comfortable with. I have a friend who I absolutely love, and I knew him as a male, and now I know her as a female because she's transgendered and she's had the whole thing. And I found him wonderfully attractive as a male and not at all attractive as a female, although I absolutely love her and am probably closer to her than I was to him. But, for me, the genitalia matters a lot, and that's just for me. But I think in general, I would agree with David. Yeah, I think genitalia is part of the sexual attraction. So this may be something else. But I also think about somebody who goes to a dominatrix, and it doesn't really matter if the person, with the whip is male or female. And they don't even have sex there. It's afterward where they masturbate, because somebody abused them and talked dirty. And that's the fetish, is being abused and talking dirty. It doesn't seem to matter the gender of the person.
By the way, it's a perfect example, Scott, of how these things can reemerge that are maybe early patterns, often around shame, that can kind of reemerge as sexual scenarios as adults.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, next question. How do you know if your addict's brain has rebooted? My husband's 4 months into recovery. We have been abstaining. We recently went through a healing disclosure. Congratulations. And I would like to start thinking about a gradual moving back into a sexual life, though I do not want the porn addict type sex life we had, where I really felt more like a prop that he was fantasizing to. I do have insecurities that he will still be looking for, or only aroused or excited about intensity versus intimacy. Thank you for this question. This is you're in a very common place for a betrayed partner right now. So don't beat yourself up about it. No, I'll let David answer.
Yeah, no, and congratulations on, I love the word healing disclosure. That's huge. And I want our clients who are on board tonight to just take that in too. Yeah, so I think, how do you tell? And by the way, there's no magic number. There's no science out of this. It's 90 days, 91, you're home free. It's very highly individual. It depends on factors we can't even name, frankly, but age, relationships, love, vulnerability, shame, all those things can go into it. But the hallmark, the indicators to me are when we start to feel attraction and arousal from another human being that we have hopefully an intimate attachment to or an emotional connection with, right? So when our brains get hijacked by addiction, especially these addictions, these are super stimulants where they, as I said earlier, they're dependent on this huge amount of dopamine to be aroused far beyond what any of us could do. And if porn is in the midst, as you indicate here, then there's this, people get used to, thousands of images maybe in a porn run, and no human being, right? Our brains, we train our brains to need one image after the other, after the other, after the other. No human being can replicate that. And also a human being and human sex is kind of messy and awkward and fun and scary and just, it's real, right? And it's not like the porn movies where the bodies are perfect and there's no risk, there's no emotional risk, you're in control. You can just change the image if you get bored. So it's a very different experience than being with a person. And so when the addict starts to be able to be aroused by just normal human scale attractions, that's huge. And by the way, and when you can be aroused and feel safe enough and secure, given what you've been through, that's also huge. And so I think just to play it, take the pressure off and have fun and be together. You know, I've talked a lot about Masters and Johnson's Sensate Focus, but I'm going to mention it here too, because it's a couples intimacy exercise that really is perfect for maybe where you're at in terms of a stage, because it communicates erotic. It's a non-sexual exercise to start, but it's an intimacy exercise where you practice giving each other pleasure by rubbing, caressing, kissing, massaging, and you get feedback from your partner, and then you take turns, and it's a really beautiful exercise to increase that communication. And similar to what we talked about before, where sex, and you say, sex for an addict is all about the snare of the script, and oftentimes the bodies we're having sex with are very much a prop in the fantasy that's playing out up here, right? That's very different than truly connected, emotionally connected sex, where you're pleasing your partner, you're aware of your partner, you're aware of the energy, and vice versa. And so it's a whole different experience. I would just try to show up. I love the Sensate Focus because it takes the pressure off. There's no need for orgasm. There's no need for erection. It's a way to start reconnecting at a very sensual level. And so good for you. I'm just the way you've worded the phrase, I'm very helpful for you. I think it's great.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, there's an emotional intimacy component for both, not only for you as the betrayed partner, where you have to trust enough to really want the sex, but also for the addict. I mean, he may be gun shy a little bit, and he may not want to be completely sexual until he feels the emotional intimacy that David was just talking about through the Masters and Johnson exercises or something similar. So I think you can, how do you spell that? How do we spell that?
Put it in the chat. I just put it in the chat.
Oh, okay.
Oh, I put it to all the panelists. Whoops.
Oh, David is adding to the chat for you. But yeah, when, you know, and the two of you may not be on the same schedule in terms of reintegrating, you know, actual, you know, full-on sex into your relationship. And, you know, one of you may have to wait on the other one to catch up. And waiting is better than jumping the gun. Yes, David?
Yes, totally.
Yeah.
Totally.
I mean, yeah, both of you get there, be there, know that you're there. And when you feel you're ready to be emotionally and physically vulnerable, and he feels he's ready to be emotionally and physically vulnerable, then it's probably time to move forward. But yeah, before that, not so much.
And it's got to be kind of no harm, no foul. You know, either person can say, "This isn't working right now. I'm trying," you know, and just really have to reduce the pressure as much as you can, and just really enjoy each other.
Yeah, I mean, I always figure good sex. If I'm not laughing at some point, it's probably not very good sex.
That's right.
You know?
Exactly right.
If I'm laughing, we're connected and we're having fun and we're both having fun, you know, and that's a very different thing than porn addict sex or sex addict sex. You know, when I was active in my sex addiction, I'm always embarrassed to tell this story, but I would pick up prostitutes and I would tell them not to talk because they would ruin the fantasy if they started talking. That's how objectified other people were for me. And that's really sad. And embarrassing in retrospect, but it's where I was, and you know, it took me. I'm still not sure I'm all the way back from that, you know, to be honest. So, all right, we are out of time. I apologize again for being late. I literally just got distracted. My fault. So we'll be back next week. I promise to be on time. And anything you want to take us out with, David?
No, just remember, shame is not your friend. Do what you can to get rid of it, intervene, rewire. And that's it.
Absolutely. So